So to your question, I think what it's revealed is who really cares about people who are incarcerated, who really cares about criminal justice reform, versus who just has it as a check mark on their list of issues that they'll give lip service to. I'm not going to call out all legislators and elected officials. Some of them have been really good. And today it was Jumaane Williams. In the past, it's been people like Julia Salazar and Carlina Rivera. There are definitely elected officials who have been trumpeting this crisis happening in our jails and prisons. But for the overwhelming majority of them, it's not even top of mind. And I think that just speaks to how they feel about people who are in our prison and jail system more generally.
Yeah, that's great. Kind of going off the point that you brought up earlier when you were introducing yourself, you talked about how you served on the Governor's Moreland Commission. So we basically wanted to ask that, what did serving on this commission, which investigated corruption in the state legislature, teach you about the state of politics in New York?
Oh man, it taught me an awful lot. It was a crash course in Albany corruption. And for people on this call, it might seem strange that there was ever a time that Cuomo wasn't thought of as this problematic character. But if I can take you back to 2013, Cuomo had only been governor a couple of years, and he'd actually been fairly successful his first few years. Meanwhile, there was a huge problem in the legislature where people were being arrested left and right for political scandals, big and small. And it was a real crisis in state government. And so Governor Cuomo and then Attorney General Schneiderman created the Moreland Commission to investigate public corruption. And I was appointed as one of its special counsels. And our team of about 15 to 20 people was tasked with investigating anything that was illegal corruption or, quote, legal corruption with respect to New York's lobbying and election practices. So legal corruption means something that is technically allowed under New York's broken laws, but probably shouldn't be, such as self-dealing, using campaign funds to enrich yourself. And there are other provisions that were just badly out of date and needed to be fixed. And so it was a really great job because we got to investigate Republicans, Democrats, special interest groups, lobbying entities, and really get under the hood of how New York State government operates. And our investigations helped lead to the indictment of the Democratic Assembly Speaker, Sheldon Silver, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, Dean Skelos. And it was actually my investigation into Governor Cuomo that led to the whole commission being shut down and Governor Cuomo trying to basically shove the entire commission under the rug. And I guess, that was it educated a lot of New Yorkers on who Governor Cuomo really was. I'd gone into the process not thinking he was some kind of savior, but he had always sort of operated from a position of the person who would do the right thing if it served him well politically, right? Like gay marriage, like gun control. And my assumption had been that, passing good government reforms would make him look good politically. So perhaps he would get on board with what we were trying to do out of self-interest, if nothing else. And he was just so against reforming government, reforming the campaign finance system. And it became very clear that the whole thing to him was supposed to be a sham. And he was very angry that there were people, not only myself, but other people on the Moreland Commission were actually trying to get to the root of corruption in Albany. And so it was a really educational experience for me about how power works in Albany, who Andrew Cuomo really was, and just sort of the pervasive culture of corruption in Albany that's really gone back decades. So I think that's more common knowledge now, and we've elected some people in the last couple of years who have specifically run against that culture in Albany. But that's sort of where we were in 2013. There certainly were not a lot of heroes up there back then.
Wow, thank you. That's really interesting. So just shifting to your campaign and specifically, we know that you've been very outspoken about how the current DA, Cy Vance, has mishandled sexual violence cases in Manhattan, specifically surrounding, obviously, like the very famous Harvey Weinstein cases. So how did Vance's system work to protect perpetrators of violence like Weinstein, and how are you working to restructure the DA's office to handle these cases differently?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really important issue. The Harvey Weinstein case got the most press, but I think the case of Dr. Haddon from Columbia University, which people should look up, there was a CNN special on that particular case, is actually worse and sort of more emblematic of what's wrong with Cy Vance's sex crimes unit. Basically, what we have in Cy Vance's office writ large is a culture where if you are from a low-income background, from communities of color, the DA's office is going to treat you very aggressively, treat you very harshly. If you come from a highly privileged background where you're able to bring especially well-heeled, well-paid, sort of elite defense lawyers into the picture, you're going to have a very different outcome. And this part of this is attributed to corruption. This is the sort of legal establishment that funds Cy Vance's campaigns and other district attorneys' campaigns around the city. Part of this is incompetence and sort of political cowardice. Cy Vance has just historically not been known to want to go after powerful entities. And how that's manifested in the sex crimes unit is there have been some very powerful men who have been accused of sex crimes, like Harvey Weinstein, like Dr. Haddon, and more low-profile cases that you may never have heard of, but have come to my attention over the course of this campaign, where allegations of very serious allegations of rape and sexual assault have been sort of swept under the rug. Cases have been delayed, cases have been dismissed. People have gotten a slap on the wrist for very, very serious crimes, mainly because of the connections of their attorneys and the connections that they have themselves. And so that's what we're trying to flip when we win this office and restructure it. We're going to be much tougher on powerful interests who have gotten away with things for too long, and that includes perpetrators of sexual violence, but also landlords, also acts of political corruption, also people who steal wages from workers. While on the other hand, we're going to take a look at the people who have been prosecuted the most harshly and think, is there a smarter, more constructive way to handle these cases? So with respect to the sex crimes unit, the thing that's the most educational to me is that, when you hear Cy Vance or you hear the NYPD talk about sex crimes, they always talk about how they're doing it in the best things for the best interest of the victims. Well, what we've learned is that victims actually have really traumatic, terrible experiences with Cy Vance's DA's office. And before we even get to the question of substantive justice, what do we do with perpetrators of sexual violence? The first thing we have to do is change the way that these allegations are handled. And that means having, for example, one prosecutor stay with a complaining victim's case throughout so they don't have to retell their story over and over again to the DA's office. Another is to let victims know what is happening in their case so that they can stay apprised of what's going on. Another is just to change literally the way the intake process works to make people feel more comfortable and have a less hostile experience reporting in the first place, where we've heard lots of stories of women being told that their stories probably aren't real or probably aren't serious. So these are all the ways that we can restructure the office just to change the experience for victims of sexual violence and then hold powerful people more accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. So our next question is about your plan to cut the prison population by 80%. So first of all, on a more ideological level, why do you think that the prison population needs to be reduced so significantly? And what's the thinking behind that? And then how did you get to the 80% number?
Sure, and I'll just tweak your question slightly if that's okay. So it's 80% reduction in jail, and just to
jail. Not
yeah. For folks out there, we definitely want to reduce the prison population too. But the distinction between jail and prison, right, is jail is people who are either pre-trial or have been convicted of minor offenses, and then prison is for sentences of 1 year and longer post-conviction. And it matters in this case because when I say reduce the jail population by 80%, I come from the sort of civil rights background and constitutional background that you're innocent until proven guilty. That's supposed to be a fundamental tenet of our justice system in the United States. And there's really very few reasons why somebody should be in jail with all the risks to your own health and safety, with all the ancillary ways that your life is affected, losing your job, losing your apartment, the stigma that comes with it, if the state has not proven your guilt. And so my belief is that most people should not be in jail pre-trial, even if they're accused of somewhat serious things. At the end of the day, it's still an accusation. And so we derive the number 80% by, it's not an exact science, but we derive the number by taking people, Manhattan defendants who are in jail now, or a couple months ago when we did this analysis, seeing what their top charge was, and then seeing of those charges, which of them did we feel merited being released pending the disposition of their case. There are some people who are accused of extremely serious things like murder, like rape, where jail and prison is certainly not the answer, but we haven't come up with an alternative system yet as a society, as a criminal justice movement. And so that's why the answer is not 100%. I did feel like it was very important to name a percentage, though. And as far as I know, I'm the only candidate in the race who has given a percentage goal. Because during my work at the ACLU, I found that when we made percentage-based demands on other prosecutors or governors or mayors, it's much easier to hold them accountable than to ask them to change policies, because the criminal justice system is a real whack-a-mole system. You can tweak one policy, but then if the other stays the same, then the same number of people wind up in jail or prison. And then you haven't really actually helped anybody. So by making an actual commitment based on numbers, you all can come back to me, a year after the election, 2 years after the election, and say that I'm not living up to the promise I made, or I am living up to the promise I made, and you're going to keep supporting me. So I think it's real important for accountability purposes to say, what is your actual goal? If your actual goal is to end mass incarceration, to stop using jail and prison as a last resort, you better be able to put a number behind it and not just say, oh, I'm gonna change our bail approach, or I'm gonna end mass incarceration. No, you better be able to back it up with receipts about how you're gonna do that.
Awesome. And just within a follow-up, within the actual office, what does it look like reducing that population from 80%? Like, what changes would be necessary to accomplish that goal?
Yeah, so there would have to be three things that would have to happen writ large. Number one, we would allow more people to just be released on their own recognizance. ROR is the sort of jargon term. And that means, it doesn't mean your case is dismissed. It just means that you've been accused of something. We're going to ROR you, which means that you just have to keep coming back for your court dates, but we're not going to hold you in jail before we've resolved what happened in your case. And so we would use that more frequently. Second, for diversion, right, there are a lot of programs that work already, alternatives to incarceration. Those can involve substance abuse or job programs, or even just the supervised release program where you have to check in with somebody once a week to confirm that you're still in this jurisdiction. So we'd increase use of that as opposed to locking people up. And then the third thing we do, which would be the most work and the hardest of these three things, is we have to look at alternative to incarceration programs where we don't have them now. And a classic example is on the issue of mental health. There are people with pretty serious mental health issues who do bad things, right? Maybe it's an assault, maybe it's stealing something. And at the moment, we don't have a great infrastructure for how to take somebody like that who has mental health issues and give them the treatment and support they need outside of the jail system. There simply aren't a lot of programs. There's not a lot of housing for that kind of thing. And so there are some areas where we would have to use our discretionary funds to support getting people like that into supportive services that they need, instead of sending them to jail, which is the current practice now. So if we do those three categories of things, we can bring the numbers down by 80%.
On what you were just talking about, your drug platform, what is the Office of Special Narcotics, and why should it be eliminated? Because that's part of your platform.
Yeah, sure. And I apologize in advance for our non-New Yorkers if this gets a little bit into the weeds, but hopefully you can resonate with the broader idea, which is ending the war on drugs. Thinking about the folks on this call, the war on drugs is really the first issue that got me into activism myself. I was a member of Students for Sensible Drug Policy as a teenager, and did a lot of work on that issue in college. So this is something that I've cared about for a long time. And to me, as a 16, 17-year-old, it was intuitively obvious that the war on drugs was a sham and an absolute war on people versus war on any substance. And what we've announced in our policy platform about drug policy is how can we bring the war on drugs to a close in New York? And there's a lot of steps to that. One of them is creating a diversion program for people to get entrepreneurial economic opportunities instead of being sent to jail for selling drugs. Another is to increase treatment opportunities for people who are struggling with addiction who are caught with drugs. And another is just to stop charging people for low-level possession of all drugs. But there's a problem with what we're trying to do, and that's the Office of Special Narcotics Prosecutor. This is an office that was created during the Rockefeller drug law era of the 1970s, and it's a prosecutor position that exists across the 5 boroughs of New York, that is separate from the 5 DAs. And the Office of Special Narcotics Prosecutor specifically prosecutes drug cases. And it would be bad enough that this office sort of has its own power without the DAs. It's even worse because it's run by a woman named Bridget Brennan, who has been at that office since 1998 running it. And she is so conservative on these issues. She opposed Rockefeller drug law reform. She opposed bail reform. She opposes safe consumption sites. And as long as she's in power, all the things I just listed are going to be very hard to implement. So I proposed eliminating that office. And there's basically a 3-step process to do it. Number one, the Manhattan DA, which is the main funder of that office, can pull funding from it, which I pledged to do right away. Number two, Bridget Brennan can be replaced by a vote of 3 DAs. So I'm thinking myself, maybe Eric Gonzalez. This is where having Tiffany Caban would have been really great because that's 3 votes right there. But with 3 DA votes, you can replace the Office of Special Narcotics Prosecutor head. And then the third step is using state legislation to eliminate the position.
Great. So we'd now like to open it up to questions. Gabe Sender raised his hand. So if you would like to ask your question, go for it.
Yeah. I was just wondering what your opinion is of the implementation of New York's new bail reform law.
Sure. So a little background on this, bail reform is something that we fought for years to get. Their defense lawyers have always cared about this issue, but on the Close Rikers campaign, which started in the beginning of 2016, we made bail reform one of the main legislative changes that was necessary to closing Rikers, right? Because you can't close Rikers unless there's fewer people there. The main reason people are there is because they can't afford to pay bail. So bail reform has been a very hot issue in New York in 2016, 17, 18. And then finally, once the state Senate in New York turned blue, we were able to get it passed in 2019. And although it's not perfect, the bail reform law passed in 2019 is, in my view, that version of the law is probably the best bail law in the country, up there with California and a couple other states, New Jersey. Unfortunately, the minute the law passed, a sort of troika of conservatives, the New York Post and the tabloid culture, the law enforcement unions, and then the remaining Republicans we do have in New York politics, particularly in the state Senate, very aggressively went after bail reform in general, really scared the public into thinking that this would mean that crime would go up and that there'd be problems with public safety. And I have to say, much to my regret, that they were successful in scaring a big enough percentage of the public, including political leaders like Governor Cuomo, like Majority Leader Cousins, that when Albany got back in session this year in 2020, they decided to undo some of the changes to the bail reform law. So I'm very disappointed in that. The fight is not to be, so the fight was expected. I expected the right wing to push back on this. I did not expect Democrats to fold as quickly as they did. So I'm pretty disappointed by that. I will say that in the context of my race for district attorney, what the law does is require certain, you guys heard me use the term ROR before. What the law does is require certain offenses to be ROR. So if you're charged with a misdemeanor, for example, you cannot be held pre-trial. And what these changes recently did was add a whole bunch more laws to the category of laws that you can ask bail for, so bail eligible laws. Just because they're bail eligible doesn't mean that the prosecutor has to ask for bail, though. So as Manhattan District Attorney, I would be less affected by what happened in Albany a few days ago, because we would simply instruct our assistant district attorneys not to ask for bail in certain types of cases. Unfortunately, in other jurisdictions, the DAs are not as progressive, so they will use the changes to the bail laws to lock more people up. So I'm disappointed, but then again, we live to fight another day. There's no reason that we can't change the laws back, 2 or 3 years from now.
Awesome. Our next question is from Dylan Andres. So just unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah. I know you talked about this more broadly, but amidst this pandemic, what exactly do you think the qualifications for compassionate release should be right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm going to answer this in the New York context, but because clemency is an available tool for virtually every governor in the United States, even if you don't live in New York, my answer pretty much applies. So, we don't have, so in New York, we don't have medical furloughs, but I do think, I will get to that in a second, as what I think could be the real sweeping solution to helping more people who are vulnerable. But I'll start with the conventional thing that we can do. We have a clemency program in New York, which is that you can apply for clemency at any point, and the governor can grant clemency. There are currently several hundred people, most of whom are quite old and right in the demographic of people who would be vulnerable to COVID, who already have clemency applications before the governor. Now, some of those people have done enormous work in prison to rehabilitate themselves, are ready to come home, have a community to come home to. You may have people on the other end of the spectrum who have not really shown that they're ready to come home. Nevertheless, the overwhelming majority of those hundreds of people are basically a signature away from being released from prison. There's no legal hoop and obstacle really that we have to go encounter. The governor could just sign their paperwork and they could be home soon enough. So that's where the advocacy starts. Grant clemency to people who have asked for it. Now, the governor, a month ago, asked for emergency powers, and he's been using those emergency powers in a variety of ways, especially around, for example, building hospitals and getting ventilators. Those same emergency powers would allow him to create a medical furlough program that doesn't exist today, which would basically say, if clemency means that your incarceration is over and you can go home, a furlough would be something more temporary, saying you can be released pending this pandemic, which would reduce strain on the prison system, which would reduce the odds of somebody who's vulnerable getting sick in the prison system, but your sentence is not over. You'd basically be serving your time at home under house arrest or not under house arrest. There's a whole variety of ways you could go with it. And given the politics of incarceration, which, as we've discussed, are pretty bad, a medical furlough program might be a way to help more people who otherwise would not really be eligible for clemency. For example, if somebody's 62 years old and they've only served a few years of their sentence, they're very vulnerable, but it's unlikely you're going to grant clemency to somebody who's only a few years into their long sentence. So a medical furlough program would be a way to help a much broader category of people. So that's what I proposed. Like I said, Cuomo's moved very little on any of those things.
So just a follow-up question to that, do you think, how do we assess how Cuomo's handled this crisis? Because he's been getting a lot of positive press for kind of the executive leadership skills he's put forward. So just wondering if you have any comment on that.
Yes, I have some interesting insight onto that from my experience at Moreland. And I wrote this on Twitter a few times early in the crisis when he was getting enormous praise for his work. Cuomo is ultimately a micromanager and a very intensive project manager. So when you talk about leadership, I firmly believe that leadership is investing in others, and that you can get the most done when you invest in other people, because then you can have more people moving a mission forward, moving a goal forward. I think it's interesting to note that we're now, 5 weeks into Cuomo's press conferences. How many members of the governor's team can you even name? And if the answer is not very many, that's part of what Cuomo's problem has been as an executive in New York State. Cuomo tends to micromanage New York State governance. If he cares a lot about an issue, he will be all over it. He will be a master of the details. He will personally make decisions about staffing. And I experienced this during the Moreland Commission. He would personally weigh into investigations, block subpoenas from going out, tell people who they should and shouldn't investigate. But if he doesn't care about an issue, it's going to slide on the back burner in terms of state politics, and probably nothing will get done. He's not somebody who trusts, for example, a health commissioner or a gaming commissioner or an environmental commissioner to take charge and lead and do something. So how does this relate to COVID-19? I think in the early days, Cuomo very much seemed like the kind of leader America wanted, somebody who was hands-on, getting his hands dirty, knew what was going on. But as you've seen as this process has gone on, he does not trust other people on his team very much. He has a very small cadre of people he relies on. And that's not really what you want managing a pandemic. There's a lot of complicated moving parts here. And I firmly believe that one of the reasons that we've gotten stuck on clemency is that because it's not a Cuomo priority, it just isn't going to happen. He wants to micromanage every part of the pandemic response. So I would actually be pretty critical of his leadership skills, which I know is not the popular opinion at the moment, but this is something I've seen over the last 10 years. He actually is a pretty poor executive. He's a very good project manager. And if that helps us build some more hospitals, then that's good for especially our seniors in New York who are being flooded into these hospitals. But it's not the right way to manage a crisis. The best way to manage a crisis is to have a large team that you can count on and really trust in their leadership.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. It's really interesting. So our next question is from Lucia. So if you can just unmute yourself, go for it.
So like your platform is like especially like I don't know, like different because you're like it provides like a lot of like solutions and opportunities for people who sell drugs as well as people who are caught like using them. So what specific solutions are you proposing? And like why did you take this approach? Because obviously it's very different from a lot of the other DAs and a lot of other candidates.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. It starts with personal experience. I mean, there's people I grew up with who sold drugs, and some who still do. And I've rooted this campaign very much in honesty. There's a saying that if you don't lie, then you don't have to have a good memory, and it's true, right? Like I have seen in the 37 years that I've lived in New York, I've seen how our criminal justice system is broken. And I have ideas about how to fix it. And you can only fix a system if you're honest about it. Now, when it comes to the drug war and to drugs, we've moved from a position that we have to lock up all people who sell and use drugs to a slightly more enlightened position that maybe we shouldn't lock up people who are suffering from addiction because addiction, is really hard to break. And so there are people both using and people selling/using drugs who have addiction issues, and we should figure out better ways than throwing them in jail and prison. So that's a good step forward, but it's not the whole truth. There are plenty of people who sell drugs not because they're addicted, but because it is their best and only source of economic stability. It is the best way for them to make money given the opportunities in their community. And if we're not honest about that, then we're not really going to solve the problem. Now, one solution could just be to like turn a blind eye and let them sell drugs, right? The problem is that the local community is not supportive of that. The same communities of color that are prosecuted by mass incarceration and the war on drugs also don't want people selling drugs in their lobbies, selling drugs in their stairway, selling drugs on their corner. So we have to do something about the problem. And the solution I've come up with is to offer people who get caught selling drugs an economic opportunity to do something else. So that doesn't mean a minimum wage job because that's less attractive than selling drugs. It means an economically sustainable future that is different than selling drugs. And what exact programs those look like, I have some ideas, but I also don't want to be overly prescriptive because, to be honest, I don't know exactly what opportunities would be exciting to somebody who's 19 and selling drugs. I would want people who are from that demographic to be part of the conversation. I can tell you, though, from my work on the Close Rikers campaign at the ACLU that I've seen some really positive programs that are in alternatives to incarceration where people do learn economic skills that propel them forward. So the best example I can think of, even though it's somewhat small, is Drive Change. Drive Change takes people who are young people on Rikers and puts them in a 6-month apprenticeship program where they help run a food truck that makes sandwiches and a whole bunch of other things that goes around New York. At the end of that 6 months, they're placed into, an upscale or a well-paying restaurant or bakery or cafe, so they can stay in the food industry, making well above minimum wage, and sort of stay in that. And so if you like food, if you like the food industry, you get 6 months of on-the-job training, and then you get placed into a good job, and you don't have to go back to that illegal economy you were part of before. So I think that's an example of the type of program that I would be supportive of. And again, I think that actually will get to the core of, what is going on here. This person is selling drugs because they need to pay the bills. And so what are we going to do about that?
Awesome. Thank you. The next question is from Kate. So just feel free to unmute yourself.
So how do you think the school to prison pipeline in New York City connects to New York's very uniquely segregated, or not uniquely, but very segregated school system? And what steps do you think should be taken to end that or begin to end that?
Sure. Are you a track and field runner by any chance?
Yes, I am.
I saw the PSAL in the background. The school to prison pipeline is a big problem in New York. It's something that's a little bit out of the hands of the DA's office, but I'll tell you some of my thoughts on it. That I used to work at the CCRB, which is the Police Oversight Board, for New York City. And it is a semi-effective agency at trying to hold police officers accountable for misconduct. And so during my time there, I got to see all of the complaints made by students and parents about the role of police in the schools during the time I was at the CCRB. And what you essentially have in New York is two school systems. They're different in all the different kinds of ways: access to resources, classroom size, but certainly when it comes to security, you have certain problems in every high school in America around school fights, around drugs in school, around occasionally people bringing a weapon to school. This is sort of universal. And the difference is in our high-end school, private schools, and elite public schools, they very much try to settle the problem internally because the school is considered a community. And when you're in a community, you're trying to resolve things in a way that's most constructive for everyone involved. So maybe a parent gets called, maybe there's some school discipline, but at the end of the day, the school does not want to call the police. They want to solve the problem on their own. In contrast, when you have some of our public schools, especially ones that are already targeted by the NYPD, the solution involves police showing up, arresting people, charging people with assault, charging people with weapons possession, whatever it may be. And you immediately take that young person and put them on a very different life track. So I'm very opposed to that form of policing in schools. And the de Blasio administration has taken some steps to change the policies from the Giuliani administration regarding the role of police in schools. But frankly, from my experience, it seems to be precinct to precinct, school to school, how it's actually implemented. What I have said more broadly about young people and the school to prison pipeline from a DA's perspective is that I don't want to prosecute anybody under the age of 18 as an adult for anything. That's different than the law we have currently. Under our current laws, for most crimes, you have to be 18 to be charged as an adult, but for certain crimes, you can still be charged as a 17, 16, even as a 14-year-old, right? The tragedy that happened in Morningside Park, right? That 14-year-old is being tried as an adult. So I will say that my contribution to ending the school to prison pipeline is I will not prosecute anybody who's under the age of 18 as an adult, regardless of crime.
Could you just go over some of the laws that in New York you don't have to be 18 to be considered an adult?
Sure. So it's important to understand why raise the age is sort of so sloppy and why we have the law we have. So there was an effort from 2014 onwards to raise the age, which means raise the age of responsibility for crimes from 16 to 18. New York was one of the last two states in the country to charge 16-year-olds as adults for all crimes, the other being North Carolina. And we went to battle in Albany and lost multiple times. Finally, in 2017, we had a breakthrough. But at that time, as you may remember, the Senate was controlled by a coalition of Republicans and the IDC. The IDC was supportive of making changes. The Republicans were not. And the compromise that was arranged at the time is for misdemeanors and certain nonviolent felonies, youth under the age of 18 would be dealt with in family court, which is what advocates have been asking for. For violent felonies, they would be tried as adults. And for certain types of felonies, there would be this youth part, which is still confusing and still being set up, 2-3 years later, where it's sort of like there's more punishment than family court, but it's not quite like being tried as an adult. It's kind of a mess. And the reason it's a mess is because we didn't have the state Senate we needed to get a good bill through. So I would personally recommend people going back to the drawing board on that one and trying to get a clean raise the age bill. That said, violent felonies can still be charged people can still be charged as an adult if they're 16 or 17. And then there are certain crimes, capital offenses, where the age, I believe, doesn't matter at all. I think there's no limit to how young you can be, but I might be wrong. It's not my area of specialty. But that's why a 14-year-old who's charged with murder can be charged as an adult.
Got it. Thank you. Our next question is from Julian. So just go ahead and unmute yourself.
You talked a little bit about your opponents, but could you tell us a little more about what makes your campaign different from others and what you hope to accomplish with it, even if you don't win?
Yeah, I think I've spent my career sort of in two spaces. One is in the criminal justice space as a lawyer, and the other is in the progressive political space as somebody who has fought not only for legislation, but electorally for a number of really strong progressive candidates, some who have won, like AOC and Julia Salazar, some who have lost, like Zephyr Teachout. And what I'm bringing into this race is a unique perspective on how to reform the criminal justice system and actually get it done. To me, if you have the right views on criminal justice, that's great. That's an important step from our incumbent Cy Vance. But if you don't have the experience of taking on the political system and understanding how to get things accomplished, you're going to get beaten back and be unsuccessful in changing the system. We've seen just from this example of bail reform in the last year how strong reactionary forces are against change. So, in my experience, I've gone up against the political establishment when I was on the Moreland Commission, including Governor Cuomo. I've taken on Mayor de Blasio and won the campaign to close Rikers Island by getting the whole city to commit to closing Rikers. And I've worked on every issue sort of in the criminal justice chain, from policing to bail to parole, during my work on the ACLU, my work at the CCRB. So I have a unique ability to get the politics of this done, which I think are going to be really hard. I mean, implementing all the things that we've been talking about during this hour is going to be immensely challenging. But I think with the right political sophistication, with the right sort of ancillary organizing, pushing these things behind it, we can get these things done. So I think I'm the only candidate that brings the combination of believing in the right criminal justice reform measures and having an actual plan for how to get them done. I think I'm the only candidate with that in the race. And in terms of what my goals are for this campaign, beyond winning, I would say they're twofold. And I think we're doing a pretty good job on both so far. Number one is to organize Manhattan residents who are impacted by the criminal justice system, to give them a voice, to give them a campaign to work through. And so we've been doing a lot of really great organizing and NYCHA housing with formerly incarcerated people. So that's number one sort of side goal, is to organize people who are directly impacted in Manhattan. The second is to push really bold policies into the conversation. So folks had asked before about our plan to abolish the special narcotics prosecutor. We're the first time a campaign has ever suggested that, even though this office has been causing mayhem for decades. So we're going to be pushing a whole series of really bold policy proposals that all the other candidates are going to have to decide if they agree with them, which is good. We'll be happy if other candidates come on board with our proposals. Or if they don't, how they can really call themselves criminal justice reformers if they don't believe in these practical solutions. So those are two of the ways that I'm measuring the success of this campaign day by day.
Awesome. If anyone else has any questions, Julian, do you still have a question?
I guess I could,
Yeah.
I could ask another question if no one else has one. But if someone else has one, then go ahead. But I was just going to ask, what are examples of like effective criminal justice reform in other states or even internationally that affect your policies?
We borrow from a lot of the ideas that we have are borrowed or done in partnership with advocates from around the country. So I don't think there are that many jurisdictions that are way ahead of New York. Criminal justice is a problem all over the country. But there are places that do things a little bit better than us. I'm certainly following the lead of what Chesa Boudin is doing in San Francisco in terms of implementing some of the ideas that we have in our campaign. But one of our proposals is the 20-year cap on sentencing. And that comes from the Sentencing Project, which, as the name suggests, that's sort of their thing. And so they're a national collective of organizations working on sentencing reform. And the idea of capping sentences at 20 years is something that we are the first campaign ever to push for that in the district attorney race. But we didn't say it was our idea. It's built on years of advocacy and best practices and data that was collected by other advocates from around the country. That example also, looks to international best practices. Very often, there's a lot of Western European countries and other countries that are ahead of us in terms of criminal justice reform. I always talk about how Germany has 1/8 the incarceration rate of the United States. People mention Scandinavia, but they're just better than us at everything. So people kind of tune out when you mention Scandinavia. But Germany, not a country known as being historically pacifist, has 1/8 the incarceration rate we do. And they have a completely different mindset around the rights of people who are incarcerated and the role of the state in making sure somebody is ready to come home and ready to contribute to society when their sentence is over. So I borrow a lot from work that's being done around the world. Obviously, when it comes to the war on drugs, places like Portugal and Uruguay are very far ahead of the United States in decriminalization. So yeah, I would say that for the most innovative ideas in our campaign, some of them we came up with ourselves, like abolishing a special narcotics prosecutor, but other ones we would borrow from either the advocacy community or best practices from other countries.
Okay, so Moxie Strom, do you want to ask your question?
Do you think, like, what would be the place of, like, prisons in a kind of ideal system, or, like, would they have a place at all? Like, what would they be doing in, like, an ideal world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it depends on the timeline that you're talking about. So for you all, I would put the question back on you because you're working on a different timeline even than I am, right? I would say that the answer to your question for me as a candidate for district attorney, what is the best I can hope to accomplish in the next number of years when we win this office and transform the office and set an example for the country, is basically figure out the best way to stop a person's cycle of harm from occurring and get their lives back on track. So for so many people, that means getting to the underlying root cause of why they committed the harm. Is the root cause have to do with substance use? Does it have to do with mental health issues? Does it have to do with economic desperation? Does it have to do with trauma that they have not ever had the opportunity to process? So that'll get you, a decent chunk of the way there, but it's not going to solve everything. If there's somebody who has not gotten the chance to process their trauma and has had a hardened life in crime for the last 50 years, I don't think I have like some magic bullet policy that's going to change that person overnight. So there are going to be people who keep committing serious crimes, and we don't have a great idea right now at this moment about what to do when somebody intentionally causes, this is sort of the standard I think about, when somebody intentionally hurts another person with malice. I mean, that still happens, and I don't really know what we do about those folks right now. I would love to hear people's ideas, during this campaign about what we do in those situations, and restorative justice is certainly a good idea, but it doesn't work for everybody. Your timeline is different though, because if you're talking about how to change the system in the long run, so much of what people in communities most affected by crime, most affected by incarceration need comes from outside the criminal legal system. People need access to good health care, good access to good education, access to stable housing. Stable housing is the number one indicator of crime. We need to reform everything from the resources we give to young parents, which would stop more kids from ending up in foster homes. Foster homes are another conduit into the criminal legal system. So I think for your generation, you can think about what is a 40-year plan to actually get at the root causes of what leads to crime, what leads to instability in homes. And that will do way more to change things than what any district attorney can do. So to sort of recap, my timeline is, what can we do to get the most people's lives on track without using jail or prison at all? And for you, it should be, how do we eliminate jails or prisons entirely by actually investing in people, especially early in their lives?
Yeah. So we'll take one last question and then we'll wrap it up. Claire?
Yeah. What are your opinions on voting rights for prisoners?
I'm glad we ended with an easy question. I have been a strong supporter of voting rights for people in prison for many years. Voting rights is something I worked on early in my career. The question that the young man had before about borrowing from other countries, in many European countries, you never lose the right to vote, and even when you're in prison. And I think that's the appropriate way to think about it. Voting is a fundamental right that you should never lose. And as we know, there's all kinds of assaults on voting rights, not just for people who are incarcerated, but for people all over the country. We just saw it in Milwaukee, Wisconsin earlier this week. So I know it doesn't rise to the top of most voting rights experts' list, and a lot of people come up with the more watered down version of giving rights to people when they come home from prison. But I think let's just keep it simple. The right to vote is sacred in this country. It should be fundamental, and you shouldn't lose it when you go into prison, and you shouldn't have to fight and try to get it back when you come home. It should just be something that you always have. So that's my position on voting rights in jail and prison.
Awesome. Well, thank you for answering so many questions. I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about your campaign if people want to volunteer or visit your website or follow you on social media or whatnot. So we can end with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free to, for the host, if you want to put this information in the chat. I don't know if that's easier, but we have a really exciting campaign that I would love for people to join. And right now, during this COVID period, even if you're not in New York, you can definitely help out because all of our organizing is digital. And we sort of meet up on Zoom, and then we break out to do calls and texts and messages. But basically, we're organizing several days a week. We're focusing at the moment on checking in with people to make sure that they're doing okay during the coronavirus and seeing what ways we can be helpful to them. But hopefully, once we move past the worst of this, we're focused on organizing communities most impacted by incarceration. So that's East Harlem, Lower East Side, Washington Heights, and people who live in NYCHA housing. So you can go to janos4da.com to sign up to be a volunteer. You can also email me directly. I'll give it to all of you. It's janos@janos4da.com. And I check that pretty regularly. If you're sort of a wonk and you want to get involved with policy, we always have a ton of policy work that we're doing. Even right now, we've got a bunch of things that we're working on. So if that's the part of the campaign you'd like to be a part of, then you can tell me that when you reach out. And yeah, I would just say, when you follow us on social media, I'm on Twitter at Janos Marton. We have a Facebook page, Instagram, Janos4da. And if you follow us on those social media platforms, you'll see that we do these kind of videos all the time. It's a great way to learn more about the criminal justice system. I have a Thursday night dinner series where last night I had my friend Ronald Simpson Bay on as a guest. He's somebody who served 27 years in Michigan prison for a crime he didn't commit. And he broke down sort of how COVID-19 looks from the inside for people who are trying to stay safe in prison. And so we always try to have interesting guests and conversations. So if you follow us on social media, you'll be able to tune into those as well.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming. Please feel free to work for Janos or reach out to him or go to the Thursday night dinner session. And I think Durga's just going to end quickly and then we'll end the meeting.
Yeah. Again, thank you all for coming. We're so happy that you were able to make it. Janos, thank you for being here. I think this was great. I'm so happy that we were able to discuss all of this, and we'll get back to all of you with all this information, everything that was discussed. And And if you want to get more involved in Coalition Z, now is the perfect time. My microphone cut out, sorry. Where we're all just sitting on our phones, but a lot of organizing is happening right now, and our lovely policy director, Gabe, is also connecting people with campaigns, and tons of things are happening over at Coalition Z. So head over to our website, coalitionz.org, to find out how to get involved right now. So yeah, we're super excited for all that's going to happen, and stay tuned for more events like this. Thank you, Janos.
Thank you. Appreciate you all.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.
Take care. Stay safe.